the wife who left me when I was already down. Paul had always believed in the idea of a perfect life, and in many ways, he had it. A job that paid well, a wife he adored, and a beautiful home in the suburbs. Everything seemed in its place, like the pieces of a puzzle that had finally fit together. He'd worked hard to get where he was, and every morning when he woke up beside Donna, the woman who made his world brighter, he couldn't help but smile. Life felt like it was unfolding just as it should. Donna was everything Paul had ever wanted in a partner. They had met years ago, and what started as a casual acquaintance had blossomed into something neither of them had expected. Their connection was instantaneous, and after years of growing together, they had settled into a routine that was comfortable. There was nothing extraordinary about their life, but for Paul, it was perfect. A modest home, simple dinners, weekends spent laughing together, it was all enough. Paul's work had been a constant source of pride for him. He had landed a high-paying job at a marketing firm right after graduating college, and it had been his passion ever since. He was respected by his colleagues, often praised for his dedication and sharp instincts. Donna, who worked as an interior designer, shared similar career success. Their income allowed them to enjoy luxuries like vacations, new furniture, and the occasional spontaneous night out. Their friends often commented on how enviable their relationship seemed, how in sync they were, how well they complemented each other. But life, as it often does, had a way of throwing curveballs. It all started one Monday morning when Paul walked into the office to a meeting with his manager, his mind already preoccupied with the presentation he was preparing. The words, "We've had to make some cuts," rang in his ears louder than anything else. Within hours, Paul found himself unemployed. The shock was almost unbearable. For years, he had prided himself on his stability, the security of knowing exactly what was coming next. Now, with a single email, his world had come crashing down. His first instinct was to go home and share the news with Donna. He knew she would support him, she always did. She was his rock, the one person who could make him feel like everything would be okay, no matter what. But things didn't go exactly as he had imagined. Donna's reaction, though kind, was laced with a subtle unease. She told him it would be fine, that things would work out, but there was something off in the way she said it. The uncertainty in her voice, the brief glance at her phone as she spoke, Paul didn't think much of it at first, chalking it up to the stress of their situation. In the weeks that followed, the tension between them only grew. Donna's behavior shifted subtly. She spent more time out of the house, going to errands that stretched longer than expected. Her once warm and open demeanor became more distant. At first, Paul blamed the strain of financial uncertainty. But as time passed, the cracks began to show. And it wasn't just the job loss. Something about Donna had changed. He just couldn't put his finger on it. The weeks after Paul lost his job felt like walking on a tightrope. Every day, he would send out resumes, attend interviews, and try to keep up the appearance of optimism for Donna's sake. But the stress of being unemployed wore on him, and he could feel it eating away at him bit by bit. What hurt even more, though, was the growing distance between him and Donna. At first, Paul tried to be patient. He knew Donna was under stress, too. She had always been supportive, a constant source of strength in his life, and he thought this would be no different. But lately, she had been distant. In the mornings, when he would make coffee, she would often slip past him without so much as a smile, absorbed in her phone, scrolling through something Paul couldn't see. She was becoming more secretive, and Paul couldn't help but wonder what was going on. It wasn't just the phone, though that, by itself, made him uncomfortable. Donna had always been open with him, so why the sudden need for privacy? She would leave for errands, but Paul started to notice that these errands often took longer than they should. She'd tell him she was heading out to pick up a few things from the store, but hours would pass before she came back. When she did, she would brush off his questions about where she'd been, giving vague, half-hearted answers that never seemed to line up with the time spent away. And then there were the nights. A few weeks ago, they had spent their evenings watching Netflix together, making dinner, and talking about their days. But lately, Donna had started staying out more, going to work events or meeting friends for drinks. Paul didn't mind her having a social life, but the frequency of these nights out, combined with the unexplained absences, began to eat away at him. The most unsettling part was that when she was home, her attention seemed to be elsewhere. She'd leave the room to take phone calls in private, and when Paul asked about it, she'd simply say it was work stuff or that it was nothing important. But the way she said it, the sharpness in her voice, made him feel like he was asking for something he had no right to know. And that bothered him. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it only grew stronger. Every time he looked at her, there was a distance in her eyes, a kind of withdrawal that wasn't there before. Paul couldn't help but wonder if it was him. Was it his job loss? Was she disappointed in him? He questioned whether he had become less of the man she married, a man who had once been so confident and assured. But what hurt the most was that Donna hadn't talked to him about it. She hadn't shared her worries or concerns. She had just retreated. One evening, after a particularly awkward dinner, Paul sat on the couch, flipping through channels, his mind racing. He kept telling himself it was just stress, just the weight of everything piling on. But something about Donna's behavior nagged at him. It wasn't just her odd habits, it was the way she was treating him. She was treating him like an outsider in their own life. As the night wore on, Paul's thoughts consumed him. Was he overthinking this? Was he just looking for problems because he didn't want to face the larger ones in his life? Or was something more going on here? He glanced over at Donna, who was sitting across from him, half-heartedly scrolling through her phone again, her face illuminated by the screen. A sinking feeling hit him in the pit of his stomach. He wanted to trust her, he really did. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. The doubt gnawed at him, and though he wanted to deny it, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between them and it wasn't for the better. Paul wasn't sure what he was expecting, but that evening, everything changed. He had just returned from yet another disappointing job interview, his self-esteem battered, and his frustration growing. It felt like the world was against him, and as he walked through the door, all he wanted was the comfort of home, the solace of Donna's presence. But something in the air felt off, he couldn't shake it. Maybe it was just his anxiety about the future. Or maybe, deep down, he knew. Donna was in the kitchen, her back turned as she hummed quietly to herself, seemingly lost in thought. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and for the first time in weeks, Paul's eyes were drawn to it. The buzzing stopped almost immediately, and for a split second, Paul thought he had imagined it. But when he heard it again, louder this time, something in him snapped. He walked over to the kitchen counter without thinking. It wasn't like Paul to snoop. He had always trusted Donna implicitly, she was his partner, his wife, but that little voice in the back of his mind pushed him forward. The phone sat there, innocently enough, face down. But it had been buzzing with urgency, and there was a name on the screen that Paul didn't recognize, Tommy. His pulse quickened. Was he being paranoid? His heart thudded in his chest as he picked up the phone, not entirely sure why he felt compelled to do so. He glanced at the screen, checking the text that had just come through. "Can't wait to see you tonight. Dinner at 8, it read. Paul's mind spun. His first instinct was to put the phone down, to pretend this wasn't happening, but something inside him forced his fingers to scroll further. He wasn't proud of it, but it was as if he needed confirmation. What he found sent a cold shiver down his spine. The messages weren't just casual, they were intimate. Flirty remarks, inside jokes, and words of affection that Paul had never seen between them. The text spoke of secret plans, meeting at a hotel, messages about how much they missed each other, and the chemistry was undeniable. His hands trembled as he read, each word hitting him harder than the last. He could feel the ground beneath him crumble. His thoughts were a chaotic mess of disbelief, anger, and pain. Was this real? Was she really cheating on him? The thought was so foreign, so out of place, that he had trouble fully processing it. How long had this been going on? Was it months? Weeks? The sound of Donna walking into the kitchen snapped him out of his haze. Paul quickly placed the phone back down, pretending as if nothing had happened. He felt as though he was suffocating, but he managed to keep his composure, to not give away that his world had just shattered in an instant. Donna didn't seem to notice the tension in the air, or maybe she was just too distracted by something else. She smiled at him, asking how his day went, but it felt like she was a million miles away. Paul's mind raced as he fought to contain the fury and heartbreak threatening to overwhelm him. "Fine," he replied, trying to sound normal. "Just tired. Nothing new." Donna nodded, but Paul couldn't focus on her words. His mind replayed the texts. "Dinner at 8? Can't wait to see you?" His stomach churned, but he forced himself to remain calm. There would be time for confrontation later, but right now, he couldn't trust himself not to explode. He excused himself to go upstairs, claiming he needed a nap. His legs felt like lead as he climbed the stairs, and when he entered the bedroom, he locked the door behind him, closing himself off from the woman he thought he knew. The betrayal was suffocating, and he felt trapped in a nightmare he didn't know how to wake up from. The discovery left him reeling. How could Donna do this to him? How could the woman he loved betray him in such a devastating way? The questions spiraled endlessly in his mind, each one more painful than the last. And even though he hadn't yet confronted her, Paul knew that things would never be the same. The life he had thought he knew, his home, his marriage, his future, was built on a lie. Paul had barely slept that night. His mind kept running through the same painful loop, revisiting the texts on Donna's phone, replaying the words over and over in his head. He couldn't believe what he had discovered, but the evidence was irrefutable. He had never imagined that something like this could happen to him, not to his marriage. But there it was, undeniable. The next morning, he couldn't bring himself to pretend everything was okay. Donna had left for a meeting early, her usual goodbye kiss replaced with a distracted glance as she hurried out the door. Paul sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair where she had just been. His stomach was in knots, and all he could think about was what he'd seen. The weight of the betrayal was too much to bear. He needed answers. He needed to confront her, but the thought of doing so terrified him. What would he say? How could he even begin to ask her about Tommy, about the affair, when everything had seemed so perfect just days ago? He felt a rush of anger mixed with confusion, the hurt threatening to consume him. When Donna came home later that afternoon, Paul had made up his mind. He couldn't keep living in the shadow of doubt. He couldn't let her continue deceiving him, and he wasn't going to sit by and pretend nothing was wrong anymore. He had to know the truth, even if it destroyed him. Donna entered the house with her usual distracted energy, shrugging off her coat as she glanced at Paul. He didn't speak right away. The tension in the room was palpable. Paul had never been one to raise his voice, never one to start a confrontation, but today, it felt like he had no other choice. His voice came out quiet, but firm. "Who is Tommy?" he asked. Donna froze, her eyes widening slightly. It wasn't the reaction Paul had expected. He thought she might deny it, or maybe try to cover it up with some flimsy excuse. Instead, she looked almost caught off guard, like she wasn't expecting him to ask so directly. She opened her mouth, but the words didn't come out right away. Paul could see the gears turning in her mind, and it made his stomach churn. Was she thinking of an excuse? A lie? Or had she already made up her mind that this wasn't something she'd own up to? Finally, she sighed, dropping her bag onto the counter. "Paul, it's not what you think." The way she said it, so casual, as if it were just another minor issue they could brush under the rug, sent a wave of anger surging through Paul. "Not what I think." His voice rose without him even realizing it. "Then what is it, Donna?" "Because I've seen the texts. I've seen the plans. The way you talk to him. Don't tell me this isn't what I think." Donna's face drained of color. She took a step back, her hand instinctively reaching for the counter to steady herself. For a long moment, she said nothing, and Paul could see the guilt written all over her face. "I never meant for this to happen," she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. It started off as nothing. It was just an escape, a way to get away from the stress. I didn't want it to get to this point." Paul's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to scream, to yell at her, but instead, he stood frozen, the hurt drowning out all other emotions. "An escape," he repeated, his voice raw. "You were having an affair, Donna. With someone you barely know. And you didn't think that would hurt me?" Her eyes were welling with tears now, but Paul wasn't sure if they were for him or for herself. "I never wanted to hurt you," she pleaded, reaching out for him. I was confused, and I didn't know how to deal with everything. I felt like you were slipping away from me, and I didn't know how to fix it. Tommy was just someone who made me feel wanted again." The admission hit Paul like a punch to the gut. The words echoed in his mind. Someone who made me feel wanted again. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a betrayal of the person he had been, the man she had once loved. He had given her everything, and it still wasn't enough. "I don't know what to say," Paul said, his voice hollow. He took a step back, his body shaking. "How long has this been going on? How long have you been lying to me? To us?" Donna's voice wavered. "A few months. I'm so sorry, Paul. I never meant for it to get this far. It was a mistake, and I don't know how to fix it." The words rang in his ears, but they felt empty. No apology could erase what had happened. No explanation could take back the trust she had shattered. "I don't know if I can forgive you," Paul said, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't want to feel like this. He didn't want his marriage to end, but deep down, he knew it already had. The reality of her infidelity was too much for him to ignore. Donna's face crumpled, but Paul didn't have it in him to comfort her. Not anymore. His heart was broken, and all he could feel was the weight of her betrayal. "I need space," Paul said, turning away. "I need time to think. I don't know what to do with this anymore." The days following the confrontation were a blur. Paul had locked himself in a painful limbo, trapped between the person he once was and the person he had to become in the wake of Donna's betrayal. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a foreign space, filled with echoes of things that used to be. The silence between them was deafening. Donna, for her part, had withdrawn into herself, respecting his request for space, but the damage was already done. Paul spent his days in a haze of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to run, pack a bag and disappear, leave everything behind. But another part of him clung to the hope that he could somehow make sense of this, find some way to move forward. But every time he looked at Donna, every time he thought about Tommy, it felt like he was suffocating under the weight of her lies. Donna had apologized over and over again, pleading for forgiveness. She had explained the affair, the loneliness she had felt in the months leading up to it, and how it had all spiraled out of control. But none of it made the pain go away. Her words felt empty, like a broken record that couldn't heal the wound she had inflicted on their marriage. She had shattered their trust, and Paul couldn't help but wonder if anything could ever make it whole again. One evening, a week after their confrontation, Donna sat across from Paul at the kitchen table, the tension thick in the air. She looked tired, her eyes red from the endless crying, but there was something in her gaze that made Paul's stomach twist. He could see the regret, but also the uncertainty, like she wasn't sure if she wanted to make this right or if she was just trying to salvage something for the sake of appearances. "Paul, please," Donna whispered, her voice shaky. "I never wanted to hurt you. You have to believe that. I made a mistake, and I'm so sorry. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Paul's hands gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. He could feel the anger building again, but it wasn't the same raw fury he had felt during the confrontation. Now, it was more like an ache, a constant, gnawing pain that would not let him forget what had happened. He looked at her, his heart heavy with confusion and grief. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Donna," he said, his voice hoarse. "You broke something that can't just be fixed with words. You betrayed me. And not just once, you lied to me, day after day, while I thought everything was fine. You were my partner, Donna. The one person I thought I could rely on." She lowered her head, tears falling quietly. Paul's heart twisted at the sight of her pain, but he knew it didn't change what had happened. He had given her everything, and she had chosen someone else. The thought made him feel hollow inside. "But I love you," Donna said softly, looking up at him through tear-filled eyes. "I love you, Paul. I don't want to lose you. Please, just give me a chance to make this right." Paul felt a sharp pang in his chest at her words. He loved her, too. He always had. But love wasn't enough to fix what she had broken. He had given her everything he had, and she had taken it for granted. He didn't know if he could ever look at her the same way again. I need to think, Paul said quietly, standing up. I can't make any decisions right now. I don't know what I need, or if I can even forgive you. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving Donna alone at the table, her sobs echoing through the empty house. The sound of her crying felt like a knife twisting in his gut. But he couldn't fix this. Not yet. He needed time. Time to figure out who he was now, time to figure out what his future would look like without the certainty he had once taken for granted. Paul spent the next few days in a fog, trying to make sense of everything. The house felt like a cage, every corner reminding him of what had been lost. There were moments when he considered leaving, when he thought it might be easier to walk away from everything and start over. But then he'd remember the good times, the laughter, the shared dreams, the love they had once had. The idea of throwing it all away was unbearable. In the end, Paul knew there was no quick fix. Healing would take time, if it was even possible. He could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Was it worth trying to rebuild, or was it better to cut his losses and walk away? He didn't have the answers yet, but the one thing he knew for sure was that he couldn't continue living in limbo. He had to face the truth of his feelings, and the truth of what Donna had done to him. And as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he realized that the future he had imagined, the one with Donna by his side, had already slipped through his fingers. Days turned into weeks, and time did little to ease the sting in Paul's heart. The house had become a battlefield of emotions, where every room carried the weight of memories, some happy, some now tainted by betrayal. Paul found himself moving through the motions of life, but it felt like he was trapped in a fog, a haze that kept him from seeing clearly. He couldn't escape the constant echo of Donna's words, her pleas for forgiveness. But he also couldn't ignore the ever-growing rift between them. Donna had been doing everything in her power to make amends, attending therapy, sending endless texts, and apologizing profusely. But her efforts felt empty to Paul. No matter how many times she apologized, no matter how many tears she shed, the truth was that he couldn't undo what had been done. The silence between them had grown thick, and every time they spoke, it felt like they were two strangers trying to force their way back into a relationship that had already fallen apart. Paul didn't know how to feel anymore. Part of him wanted to forgive her, to believe that people could change, but another part of him felt a deep betrayal he couldn't shake. One evening, as Paul sat in the living room, staring at the muted television screen, Donna came in and sat down beside him. Her eyes, tired and red from crying, searched his face as if looking for some sign of hope. Paul could see the exhaustion in her face, too. It was clear she was carrying the weight of her own guilt. "Paul, I can't keep living like this," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "I've hurt you beyond words, and I can never take that back. But I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. If you'll let me." Paul felt the familiar ache in his chest, the love he still had for her. But love wasn't enough. He had learned that the hard way. The relationship they had shared, what he thought was a strong foundation, had been built on lies. And now that foundation was cracked beyond repair. "Donna," Paul began, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wish things could go back to the way they were. I really do. I wanted to believe that we could get through this. But I don't know if I can. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." His voice cracked, and he swallowed hard, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. "I need to take some time to figure out who I am without you." Donna looked at him, her face falling as the gravity of his words sank in. She reached for his hand, but he pulled away gently, his chest tight with emotion. "I can't stay in this limbo, Donna. I need space. I need time to heal. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." Tears filled Donna's eyes, and she nodded, her shoulders trembling. "I understand," she whispered. "I'm so sorry, Paul. I wish I could take back everything. I wish I had never hurt you." Paul stood up, his legs shaky as he walked toward the door. "I know you do," he said softly, turning to look at her one last time. But wishing doesn't change the reality of what happened. And I think I need to face that. Donna's sobs filled the room as Paul stepped outside, the cool air hitting him like a wave. He didn't know what the future held. Maybe Donna would change, maybe they could rebuild. But right now, he couldn't stay in the same space as the woman who had broken his heart. He needed to find himself again, to rediscover what made him whole before he could even consider rebuilding a relationship with her. For the first time in weeks, Paul felt like he was breathing again. The weight on his shoulders was still there, but it wasn't as heavy. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep living in a lie. He couldn't stay in a marriage that no longer felt like his own. As he walked down the street, the cool night air rushing past him, Paul realized that sometimes the hardest part of love wasn't staying together. Sometimes, the hardest part was knowing when to walk away. And in that moment, he made peace with the fact that he was letting go of the woman he once knew and the future he had imagined with her. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this emotional roller coaster of a story, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Have you ever been faced with a situation where trust was broken in a relationship? How did you handle it? We'd love to hear your stories and experiences. And, as always, be sure to subscribe for more gripping stories and emotional journeys. Your support means the world to us.